How God can cleanse your mind from every dangerous sin forever is not a mystery reserved for the spiritually elite, nor is it a reward granted after long years of struggled discipline or self-denial. It is a divine action that takes place the moment the human mind becomes quiet enough to receive truth. The greatest misunderstanding in spiritual life is the belief that sin is something we must fight, conquer, suppress, or control. This belief alone keeps the mind locked in conflict and gives sin a false sense of power. God does not cleanse the mind by battling darkness. God cleanses the mind by revealing light, and in that revelation darkness is seen to have never had substance of its own. The human mind believes sin is an action, but in spiritual reality sin is a belief about separation from God. Every dangerous pattern, every destructive desire, every recurring habit begins with the thought that you are apart from divine life. The moment this belief is accepted, the mind begins to act as though it must satisfy itself through the flesh, through fear, through control, or through pleasure. Yet the mind that is filled with God has no hunger for destruction. When divine presence is consciously realized, the desire for sin dissolves naturally, without effort, without strain, without willpower. The belief that sin is a condition of mistaken identity rather than a permanent reality changes the entire foundation of spiritual understanding. When sin is viewed as something inherent in a person, it becomes heavy, fixed, and terrifying, but when it is seen as a misperception, it loses its authority. Identity is the core from which all thoughts, desires, and actions arise. If a person believes they are separated from God, incomplete, or lacking, then actions will naturally flow from that belief. What is called sin is not proof of a corrupt soul, but evidence of a confused sense of self. The behavior is the symptom, not the source. Mistaken identity begins the moment consciousness accepts the idea that it is a personal mind living apart from divine life. From this belief, fear is born, and fear seeks relief. That relief may appear as control, pleasure, power, distraction, or self-destruction. These expressions are then labeled sinful and fought against, but the fighting never ends because the identity that produced them remains untouched. As long as a person believes they are a flawed self trying to become pure, they will continue to act from that assumption. The struggle itself reinforces the false identity and gives sin a sense of permanence. In spiritual truth, identity is not created by behavior, thoughts, or history. Identity is established by God and sustained by divine presence. When this truth is not known, the mind fills the gap with self-definitions, labels, and judgments. The person begins to say, I am weak, I am broken, I am addicted, I am sinful. These statements feel honest, but they are declarations of mistaken identity. The mind then works tirelessly to defend or escape from the very image it has created. What looks like moral failure is actually spiritual amnesia. God does not see sin as a permanent stain because God does not see the false self at all. Divine awareness beholds only what is real, whole, and true. When this awareness begins to dawn in human consciousness, it gently exposes the false image without attacking it. The person realizes they have been trying to fix something that never truly existed. This realization is cleansing because it removes the belief that something is wrong at the core. Without that belief, behavior begins to reorganize naturally. Mistaken identity survives on repetition, memory, and emotion. Every time a person revisits past failures or fears future weakness, they reinforce the illusion of a sinful self. Spiritual awakening interrupts this cycle by introducing a higher reference point. Instead of asking, why am I like this, the mind begins to rest in what God knows. In that resting, the false identity weakens because it is no longer being fed attention, belief, or resistance. When identity shifts from personal struggle to divine origin, sin loses its foundation. It no longer feels inevitable or powerful. The mind no longer needs to be cleansed of something evil but awakened from something false. The moment truth is recognized, the illusion collapses because it was never sustained by reality but only by belief. The cleansing of the mind begins with spiritual awareness rather than self-effort or punishment, because the human will cannot reach the level where true transformation occurs. Effort operates within the same mental framework that produced the problem. When a person tries to purify the mind through discipline, control, or self-condemnation, they are still assuming that the burden rests on them. This assumption quietly reinforces separation from God and keeps the mind trapped in cycles of guilt and temporary improvement followed by relapse. Awareness, on the other hand, does not struggle to change thoughts, but allows a higher understanding to replace them. Spiritual awareness is the recognition of God as present, active, and governing consciousness itself. It is not an intellectual belief, but an inward perception that shifts the center of attention. When awareness turns toward divine presence, the mind naturally becomes quieter. In that quietness, harmful patterns lose momentum because they thrive on noise resistance and emotional charge. Self-effort feeds the mind with constant self-monitoring, while spiritual awareness dissolves the need to monitor at all. The mind does not improve itself, it yields to something greater. Punishment has never cleansed the mind because fear cannot produce purity. Fear may suppress behavior for a time, but it does not remove desire. In fact, it often strengthens it by creating inner conflict. The mind becomes divided between what it wants and what it fears, and this division keeps consciousness unstable. Spiritual awareness unifies the mind by bringing it into harmony with truth. When God is consciously recognized as the source of life, satisfaction, and safety, the mind no longer needs to bargain with destructive impulses. Awareness works because it changes perception rather than behavior. When perception changes, behavior follows naturally. A person who becomes aware of light does not need to fight darkness because darkness is revealed as the absence of light. In the same way, when the mind becomes aware of divine reality, destructive thoughts are seen as unreal, unsupported, and unnecessary. They are not chased away but outgrown. This is why transformation through awareness is lasting, while transformation through effort is exhausting. The human tendency is to ask, "What must I do to be free?" But spiritual awareness asks, "What is already true?" This shift removes pressure and opens receptivity. The mind begins to sense that it is being held rather than judged, guided rather than tested. In this atmosphere, trust replaces tension and healing becomes possible. The nervous system itself responds to this recognition by relaxing, which further weakens compulsive patterns rooted in stress and fear. When awareness replaces effort, the mind stops trying to cleanse itself and allows God to do what only God can do: reveal truth. This revelation does not come as dramatic experiences, but as quiet certainty. The mind slowly loses interest in what once dominated it. Desires fade not because they are forbidden, but because they are no longer meaningful. Spiritual awareness does not add rules, it removes confusion, and in that clarity the mind naturally aligns with harmony, peace, and self-control. Divine grace removes the desire for sin by revealing a higher consciousness rather than by forcing moral improvement. Desire does not disappear through restraint, because restraint still acknowledges the power of what is being resisted. What truly ends desire is fulfillment, and grace fulfills the deepest hunger of the soul by revealing its oneness with divine life. When this revelation begins to dawn, the mind experiences a satisfaction that no external act can imitate. The desire for destructive patterns fades because it is no longer needed as a substitute for wholeness. Grace is not something earned through effort or worthiness. It is the natural outpouring of God's presence when the mind becomes receptive. This receptivity occurs when striving stops and humility replaces self-control. In humility, the mind admits that it cannot heal itself, and in that admission, grace enters. Grace does not negotiate with sin or analyze it. It lifts consciousness to a level where sin no longer appears attractive or relevant. This lifting is gentle yet decisive. The human mind often mistakes sin for pleasure, power, or relief. These are surface experiences masking a deeper longing for peace, security, and belonging. Divine grace addresses the root longing rather than the surface behavior. When grace reveals higher consciousness, the mind perceives life from a new vantage point. What once seemed pleasurable now feels empty. What once promised escape now feels heavy. This is not moral judgment but spiritual clarity. Higher consciousness is not a future state but a present awareness of divine reality. It is the recognition that life is already sustained by God and does not need to be supplemented by harmful behaviors. In this awareness, the mind becomes less reactive and more spacious. Thoughts slow down, emotional urgency softens, and a quiet joy begins to surface. This inner shift is what removes desire. Desire cannot survive where fullness is felt. Grace works silently. There may be no dramatic moment where temptation vanishes, but there is a growing disinterest. The mind notices that old patterns no longer call with the same intensity. Even when they appear, there is distance rather than compulsion. This distance is the evidence of higher consciousness taking root. The person no longer identifies with the urge and therefore does not feel owned by it. Because grace reveals identity rather than correcting behavior, its effects are lasting. Behavior modified by will eventually collapses under pressure, but behavior transformed by awareness remains stable. The mind begins to operate from inspiration rather than control. Choices are guided by inner peace rather than fear of consequences. This is why spiritual freedom through grace feels natural rather than heroic. The removal of desire is often misunderstood as suppression or loss, but in truth it is liberation. The mind does not lose pleasure, it gains depth. It does not lose excitement, it gains meaning. Grace does not take something away, it reveals that what was sought was never needed. In higher consciousness, the soul recognizes that it was always complete, and that recognition quietly dissolves the need to search for fulfillment in destructive ways. Freedom comes when fear, guilt, and shame dissolve in the presence of truth, because these emotions do not originate in God and therefore cannot survive divine awareness. Fear, guilt, and shame are not spiritual forces but psychological reactions created by the belief in separation. They arise when the mind assumes it is alone responsible for its survival, worth, and redemption. From this assumption, the mind judges itself, constantly measuring past mistakes and future risks. This inner courtroom keeps the soul imprisoned even when outward behavior changes. Fear is the root emotion that fuels guilt and shame. Fear whispers that something is wrong, something is missing, or something terrible will happen unless control is maintained. Guilt then forms as the belief that one has violated a rule or failed a standard, and shame goes deeper by declaring that the self itself is flawed. Together they create a heavy mental atmosphere where healing feels impossible and freedom seems distant. Yet none of these emotions are sustained by truth. They are sustained only by belief and repetition. Truth does not argue with fear or try to correct guilt. Truth simply reveals what is real. In the presence of truth, fear loses its object because there is nothing to defend against. Guilt loses its voice because there is no condemning authority in divine consciousness. Shame dissolves because identity is no longer defined by memory or performance. When the mind becomes aware of God as unconditional presence, these emotions begin to weaken without effort. The dissolving does not happen through positive thinking or self-reassurance. It happens through recognition. The mind recognizes that fear has been mistaken for wisdom, guilt mistaken for responsibility, and shame mistaken for humility. In spiritual light, these disguises fall away. The soul begins to feel safe not because circumstances improve, but because divine care is felt inwardly. This sense of safety is the foundation of freedom. As fear recedes, the nervous system relaxes and the mind becomes less reactive. Decisions are no longer driven by avoidance or self-protection. Guilt fades because the past no longer defines the present. The mind realizes that truth operates only in the now and that God is not holding records against anyone. Shame dissolves when the soul sees itself through divine knowing rather than self-judgment. This seeing restores dignity and quiet confidence. Freedom is not the absence of mistakes, but the absence of self-condemnation. When truth is present, the mind can acknowledge errors without identifying with them. Correction becomes gentle and natural rather than painful. Growth no longer feels like punishment but like unfolding. This is why spiritual freedom feels light even when change is required. The presence of truth is not dramatic. It often comes as a subtle assurance, a quiet sense of being held and understood. Yet this presence has profound effects. Old emotional patterns lose energy because they are no longer needed for survival. The mind stops rehearsing fears because peace feels more natural. This inner shift allows healing to occur at levels beyond conscious effort. When fear, guilt, and shame dissolve, the soul does not become careless but clear. Moral clarity arises not from pressure but from alignment. Actions flow from peace rather than anxiety. This is the freedom that endures because it is not dependent on perfect behavior but on sustained awareness of truth. Healing occurs when the mind yields to God rather than struggling against darkness, because struggle keeps attention fixed on the very condition one wishes to escape. The human tendency is to confront problems directly, to analyze, resist, and overpower them. While this approach may work in material matters, it fails in spiritual healing because darkness has no independent substance. Darkness exists only where light is not recognized. When the mind struggles against darkness, it unknowingly grants it reality, importance, and presence. Yielding to God withdraws that attention and allows light to be revealed. Yielding is not passivity or resignation. It is a conscious release of the belief that the personal mind is the source of healing. In struggle, the mind assumes responsibility for removing fear, desire, or sin. This assumption creates pressure, tension, and exhaustion. Yielding shifts responsibility back to divine intelligence where it belongs. The mind becomes receptive rather than aggressive, and in that receptivity, healing unfolds naturally. Darkness thrives on effort because effort implies resistance and resistance implies duality. The mind divides itself into the one who must fight and the thing being fought. This division fragments consciousness and keeps the wound active. Yielding dissolves this division by restoring unity. When the mind rests in God, there is no opponent, no enemy, and no inner war. What appeared as darkness is seen as misunderstanding. Healing through yielding happens at levels deeper than thought. The nervous system calms, emotions settle, and the body responds to the shift in consciousness. Many struggles persist not because the problem is powerful, but because the mind is tense. Yielding introduces softness, and this softness allows suppressed clarity to rise. In this state, insight replaces analysis and peace replaces urgency. The act of yielding often begins with stillness. Stillness interrupts the mental momentum that keeps old patterns alive. In stillness, the mind stops narrating its problems and becomes aware of presence. This awareness is not empty but full of intelligence, order, and care. As the mind remains here, it senses guidance without words and correction without force. Struggling against darkness often carries an unconscious belief in punishment. The mind believes it must suffer to improve or prove sincerity. Yielding releases this belief. God does not heal through punishment but through revelation. When truth is revealed, the need for suffering disappears. The mind sees that pain was never required, only understanding. As yielding becomes habitual, trust develops. Trust weakens the impulse to control outcomes and monitor progress. Healing deepens because it is no longer interrupted by doubt. The mind stops checking whether it is healed and simply lives from the awareness of being held. This allows transformation to integrate fully rather than remain fragile. Darkness loses power when it is not resisted because resistance feeds it with emotional energy. Yielding starves it by redirecting attention to what is real. The mind becomes occupied with peace rather than problems. This shift is not denial but reorientation. The focus moves from symptoms to source, from struggle to supply, from fear to presence. Over time, yielding becomes a way of life. Challenges arise, but they are met with openness rather than tension. The mind instinctively turns toward God instead of inward against itself. Healing then becomes continuous rather than episodic, and freedom feels natural rather than earned. Spiritual purity is sustained by inner stillness and constant remembrance of God, because purity is not maintained by vigilance over behavior, but by the atmosphere in which the mind lives. When the mind is constantly occupied with noise, distraction, and self-monitoring, it becomes reactive and vulnerable to old patterns. Stillness creates a mental climate where higher awareness can remain active. In this climate, thoughts slow, emotions soften, and impulses lose urgency. Purity is not something added to the mind, but something revealed when interference is reduced. Inner stillness is not silence of activity, but silence of resistance. It is the state in which the mind is no longer arguing with itself, planning its defense, or rehearsing its failures. In this state, awareness rests in being rather than doing. Stillness allows consciousness to reconnect with its source, and this connection naturally aligns thought and action. When the mind is still, it becomes transparent to divine influence. Guidance flows without force, and restraint is replaced by wisdom. Constant remembrance of God does not mean repeating words or holding a mental image. It is an ongoing recognition of presence. This recognition gently shifts the center of identity from the personal self to divine life. When God is remembered as the source of thought, strength, and satisfaction, the mind no longer seeks fulfillment elsewhere. Many lapses occur not because of temptation, but because of forgetfulness. The mind forgets its source and reaches outward to compensate. Remembrance restores orientation. Purity sustained through remembrance is effortless because it is relational rather than moral. The mind is not trying to remain pure, it is staying close. Just as proximity to light naturally dispels shadow, closeness to divine awareness naturally dispels confusion. This closeness does not fluctuate with emotion or circumstance. It is maintained through attention. Where attention rests, consciousness follows. Stillness and remembrance work together. Stillness makes remembrance possible, and remembrance deepens stillness. When the mind pauses, it becomes aware of God, and when it becomes aware of God, it naturally pauses. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle that stabilizes spiritual awareness. In this stability, impulses that once dominated lose relevance. They may arise briefly, but they pass without engagement. Purity sustained in this way is resilient. It does not depend on external structure, rules, or supervision. It remains intact even under pressure because it is rooted in awareness rather than control. When challenges arise, the mind instinctively returns to stillness instead of reaction. This return prevents small disturbances from becoming inner conflict. Remembrance of God also dissolves pride and despair equally. Pride fades because the mind knows it is not the source. Despair fades because the mind knows it is never alone. Both extremes distort purity by pulling attention away from presence. Balance is restored when awareness remains anchored in divine reality. Over time, this practice becomes natural rather than deliberate. The mind learns where peace resides and returns there automatically. Spiritual purity then ceases to feel fragile or temporary. It becomes the normal state of consciousness, not because effort is applied, but because truth is remembered and allowed to remain active within the mind. The journey of spiritual freedom and healing is not a battle to be won, but an awakening to be received. Throughout this understanding, one truth becomes clear again and again, that God does not cleanse the mind by force, correction, or fear, but by revelation. What has been called sin is not a permanent stain on the soul, but a misunderstanding about identity, a lapse in awareness of divine presence. When this misunderstanding is gently undone, the mind naturally returns to harmony without strain or struggle. True cleansing begins when the false belief of separation dissolves. The moment the mind no longer sees itself as a broken self trying to become whole, it opens to the truth that wholeness has always been present. From this awareness, effort gives way to grace and punishment gives way to peace. The mind stops trying to fix itself and allows God to reveal what is already true. This shift alone removes the foundation on which fear, guilt, and shame stand. As spiritual awareness deepens, desire itself is transformed. Divine grace does not suppress impulses, but fulfills the deeper longing beneath them. When higher consciousness is revealed, the mind experiences a satisfaction that leaves no room for destructive substitutes. What once felt powerful loses its attraction, not because it is forbidden, but because it is no longer needed. This is freedom that feels natural rather than forced and stable rather than fragile. Fear, guilt, and shame fade in the presence of truth because they are not sustained by reality. They dissolve when the mind rests in divine knowing rather than self-judgment. With their disappearance, the inner struggle ends and clarity takes its place. Healing becomes possible not through resistance to darkness, but through yielding to light. In yielding, the mind releases tension and allows divine order to restore what effort could never repair. This freedom is maintained through inner stillness and continual remembrance of God. Stillness quiets the mental noise that fuels old patterns, and remembrance keeps consciousness aligned with its source. Together they create an inner atmosphere where purity is sustained effortlessly. The mind no longer watches itself in fear but lives in awareness. Choices arise from peace rather than pressure, and discipline flows from understanding rather than control. In the end, spiritual healing is not about becoming someone new, but about remembering who you have always been. God does not cleanse the mind by changing your nature, but by revealing it. When this revelation is received, the work is complete. The mind rests, the heart is free, and the soul lives from the quiet certainty of divine presence that cannot be lost.